Thank you very much, and thanks very much, Pam. That's going to be a very tough act to follow. But it is kind of reassuring to see you can find the odd hideous picture of cows in Wisconsin, just like we can find them in Somerset and Nottingham. That's kind of reassuring. Okay, so my brief for this afternoon's talk was to look at some of the evidence that exists about how we can associate fertility performance in a herd with economic benefit. So how is fertility associated with farm efficiency? Ultimately, for fertility, really that drives investment decisions. Unfortunately, unlike mastitis, lameness, for example, I have very little in the way of welfare arguments for improving fertility, so I'm down on Nick and Pam there, who have extra layers of ways to motivate people to improve performance. When it comes to fertility, it is mostly about the bottom line. So most of the motivation to improve fertility is about the economics of it, and understanding what we know about that is critical to deciding how much effort should we devote, and particularly how much investment can we devote to improving performance. So I'm briefly just going to cover where the sources of cost are in terms of fertility. So if we reduce fertility performance in a herd, where are we losing out? Where are those losses coming from? Some of those are very obvious and very well understood, and some are much less so. And then I'm basically just going to step through the different ways that people have used to try and estimate or evaluate how much potential we might have for savings by improving fertility. So I'll look at try and do this in a fairly step-by-step way. So I'll start with the simplest ideas and look at some approaches from the UK first, and then we'll talk about some more complicated ways of approaching the same problem and look at some methods from overseas a bit later on. So if we think about the sources of cost in terms of fertility, the most obvious one is really just lost milk. So the fundamental reason why we want to control the gap between calvings in our cows is the shape of lactation curve. So the left-hand graph there is data from 500 odd English and Welsh herds over most of the last decades. There's several million lactations included in that set of data. The yellow line on that graph is average lactation curve shape for first lactation heifers. The red and white very close together at the top there are lactation curve shape for cows. So the average 305-day yield across this data set was just over 8,500 litres. So these aren't very untypical of UK herds. They're probably fairly representative of normal herds in the UK. So the fundamental reason that we're interested in fertility is that we want cows to... I'm blatantly going to fall off the back of this stage at some point, by the way. I'm just hoping I fall off in my right angle, not my left, which is a bit more broken. So the fundamental reason we try and manage fertility is that we want to try and minimise the amount of time cows spend out here at the tail end of lactation, where they're stale, producing less milk. Clearly, it's much more complicated than that, and you're about to find out how. Just one thing to highlight is that heifers, first lactation heifers, do have a lactation curve shape that's significantly different from adult cows. So heifers are generally more persistent. They yield better in late lactation and have a less peaked shape of curve. So in some situations, that can justify different fertility policies for different lactation numbers. The graph on the right there is just a similar thing from US herds, and again, you can see their curve shapes are fairly similar. So where are the sources of cost? Decreased milk production is really the most obvious one. So there's a few things to highlight there. You really got to think about this in terms of, or I think it's useful to think about this in terms of places on the farm. So the staler your herd is on average, the higher your average days in milk gets, the less efficiently you're using those on-farm resources in terms of number of places that you've got available for housing milking cows. Generally speaking, feed conversion is more efficient near peak lactation. So another reason that cows tend to be more efficient in early lactation is that. And by improving this and making sure that cows spend more time relatively close to early lactation and less time in late lactation, is that there's no fixed cost associated with the gains we're getting there. So we're just winning the margin on that milk. There are a number of other sources of cost to consider. So if we space a cow's calvings out by a greater number of days, we're going to produce less calves across the herd per year. So we're losing some calf value if we space those calving events out more. We're going to increase forced culling potentially if we have poorer fertility performance, because we're going to be forced to cull cows that we didn't get back in calf. So There's a number of potential consequences of that. It may increase replacement costs if we're needing to drive up the number of replacements that we're producing. Importantly, it can just reduce choice in culling decisions. So very commonly on farm, this leads to just retaining cows in the herd that otherwise would have been culled. So if we'd had enough replacements coming through the pipeline, we would have had much more flexibility in which cows we culled, and we'd have been able to make much more strategic decisions about which cows were paying their way. Whereas instead, often we're forced just to use up culls with cows that we couldn't get pregnant quickly enough. And the direct costs associated with fertility performance can be quite significant as well. So in terms of extra labour, semen costs, vet and med spend, those can all add up in terms of total cost. There are quite a few that are less well recognised though. So this came from some work that I did for a project looking at this that we'll come back to later on. This looked at the risk of culling in the subsequent lactation and how that's affected by calving interval, strictly speaking, how it's associated with the calving interval in the lactation that precedes it. So the horizontal axis on this graph shows previous calving interval. So for most people, probably aiming to be around the 365 to 375 mark. We talked about this in the farmer workshop this morning. And this is increasing longer calving intervals to the right of the graph. Up the side here, we've got the predicted risk of culling. So this is based on data from about 300 or 400 of the 500 herds that we looked at earlier. So the chances of a cow leaving the herd actually go up quite steeply in cows that have longer calving intervals. So in cows that have a target calving interval, they have roughly a 25% chance of leaving the herd on average. There are obviously far more of those in most herds than there are of these cows, but the cows that have a 450, 500-day calving interval potentially have quite a high chance of leaving the herd in the subsequent lactation. So a number of potential reasons for this. Again, we looked at an example of this from one of the herds that I worked with in the workshop this morning, but something that's very common to find if you have the data to look for it is that cows that hit the dry period over-conditioned, and very commonly cows that calve in, therefore over-conditioned, very frequently are cows that have had a long previous lactation. So a lot of this risk is plausibly associated with these cows gaining excess body condition and then calving in, carrying too much condition, and then all the risks that we know are associated with that. So if you have herds that have sufficient condition score data for that, it can be a very interesting thing to look at. However, there are some things on the other side of the balance. So there are some potential benefits from less frequent calvings. Clearly, you're losing litres in the tank, but you don't have to feed for those litres. So it's the margin over purchase feed, really, that you're losing on the litres that you're not able to sell. Potentially, quite importantly, we decrease the risk of all the fresh cow-associated diseases. So as Pam was saying, mastitis very, very commonly acquired either through the late dry period or very close to calving. The less often we calve a cow, the less risk of mastitis we expose her to during lactation. There's some diseases for which that's extremely obvious. So hypocalcemia, milk fever, difficult calvings, retained membranes, all of those things are clearly directly associated with calving. But there's an awful lot of evidence now that calving really is a key risk time for a lot of the lameness causes as well. It's sometimes harder to attribute, Nick's giving me a grin there, sometimes hard to attribute just how much risk of lameness we save by spacing calvings out more. But there's quite a few diseases to think about. And lastly, probably smallest in size, we've got a gain in production in empty cows. So if you have a cow that's not pregnant, she'll tend to give you very slightly more milk than an equivalent cow that is pregnant. But actually, when I've looked at this for the same project, that difference in milk yield between a non-pregnant cow and the same cow if she was pregnant, or an equivalent cow if she was pregnant, only really becomes big very close to the end of pregnancy. So it's only as we start to get towards drying off that the gap in yield between a pregnant and a non-pregnant cow really becomes appreciable. For the majority of pregnancy, it's a negligible difference. Okay, so how can we stack those up together and start to think about quantifying potential benefit from improving fertility? I'm going to talk about the kind of traditional classic UK approach first. So I think for me, one of the really key things to highlight about fertility performance, a little bit like Pam was saying about mastitis, is that it's very difficult to come to a number or an estimate of fertility cost that applies to every herd. So the herds that I work with, I would look for estimates of fertility cost and estimates of cost benefit on an individual herd basis, because these things can vary quite a lot between different herds. But if we think about an average herd, were such a thing to exist, this is the classic way to approach estimating cost of fertility. If we think back to our lactation curve shape, the red line now is the average of cows and heifers put together. If we think about what happens when we add extra days onto a cow's calving interval, so if we start from a target of 365 and think about what happens as that calving interval gets longer, what we're really doing is postponing the cow's next lactation by a day and swapping that for an additional day on the end of this lactation. So the basic fundamental concept behind this approach was to say, okay, over 305 days, her average yield is going to be here somewhere, so 27, 28 litres. Again, remember, these herds averaged about 8,500 altogether. So we're postponing that gain by 1 day, and we're swapping it for an additional day on the tail end of this lactation. So the basic concept here was that we're losing the gap between those two lines. So we're putting off her next lactation by a day, and in return, we're getting an extra day on the tail end of this lactation when she's clearly going to be less productive. So they went about it like this. You start off by working out average yield across 305 days, and then compare that with the average yield on the additional days that you're adding on. So in that particular set of herds, the gap between those two yields was about 10 litres. So for every day that you add on there, you're losing out on the margin over purchase feed on roughly 10 litres of milk. So I've tried to update these with newer costs. So at the moment, for a lot of people, probably looking at a purchase feed cost of around 8 pence a litre. Milk price is going to vary an awful lot, obviously, between different farms, and we'll come back to that later. But here I've used 23 pence a litre as a milk price, so that gives us the margin that you can see up there. So the cost of that's going to be about £1.50 for every day that we add on. Obviously, as we think about making our calving interval longer and longer and longer, as we add on more and more days for a cow, the extra days that we're adding on will be at lower and lower yields progressively. So the extra days that we get back progressively less and less valuable. Actually, that degree of decline does flatten off quite a lot. So the increase in cost as we add days on later and later is actually not generally that big when you look at this on an individual herd basis. So we can then start to add in some of the other things. So we've lost roughly £1.50 a day on margin on milk sales. We can start to think about lost calf value. It's fairly easy to come up with an estimate for that. That just relies on working out what the average calf on the farm is worth at the point when it hits the ground. Think about, what's the earliest I can market it, what will it fetch on average, and what's it cost me to get it to that point. That's obviously going to have to be averaged across all the different types of calf you'll produce, replacement heifers, dairy breed bulls, and any beef crosses that you produce. And then you divide the value of a calf by 365 days. So the estimates that I'm putting together here, I've tried to make these very conservative. So a principle I try and stick to when I do this with farmers is to come up with a conservative estimate that we're both confident in and can agree on as a starting point, and take it from there. So what I don't want to happen is that I come up with a very big estimate which then disengages the farmer. They don't believe what I'm saying. They don't believe there's that much scope to get a return on investment. I'd rather stay slightly on the conservative side. There's then some extra things to consider. So this particular work is adapted from Dick Esselmont's work in the late 90s. They allocated a cost of extra serves and vet treatments to each day. There's definitely a risk of double counting there, because often when we think about improving fertility performance, and I talked about this a lot this morning, what we're really talking about doing is getting the same number of serves in quicker. So a lot of the time we're really just talking about catching more heats, and often very often the big win is to improve submission rate, and often to accept conception where it is. That varies a lot from farm to farm, and there's certainly some farms where that wouldn't be the right place to focus. But in that situation, there may not be any cost of extra serves because you're getting the same number of inseminations in just in a shorter time period. Cost of time, vet treatment is in there as well. The gain in yield when empty, they used a figure of about 13 pence per day. If anything, has probably got slightly lower these days. And they also allocated a cost to reduce disease risk. So this one's actually quite complex to calculate. I think this is probably an area where there would be scope to revisit that in a bit more detail. It's difficult to avoid double counting costs when you do this sort of thing because a lot of the diseases happen in the same animals. So lots of animals will get hypocalcemia and then also get metritis or also get endometritis. So it's very difficult to make sure that you've allocated those costs appropriately. As a kind of sense check, a lot of those post-calving diseases, people commonly estimate cost at around £200 per case. That's a reasonable starting point for a lot of them. So even if you say, okay, well, maybe a maximum of half my cows might get a disease post-calving, so be that calving at dry period associated mastitis or metritis or hypocalcemia. If a maximum of half the cows might get one of those diseases, that's worth roughly £100 per calving. So spread that out over a year, and you get a cost not a million miles away from there. As you make the extension of the cow's calving interval longer, you obviously lose more margin over milk, but that increase is no longer that massive. So on average, you're probably looking at somewhere around the £2 mark for a typical herd, but this will vary quite a lot between individual herds. So every additional day is plausibly worth something like £2 to £3 per day, but it is worth thinking about how this looks on an individual herd basis. So good thing to consider here is just translating that into the cost of a missed heat. So if £2 a day is a realistic ballpark figure, every missed heat is worth something like £45. You're going to have to wait another 21, 22 days till the next opportunity to serve the cow. So a fairly significant amount of money. So if you save up 4 of those, you can just about afford an extra case of mastitis. Kind of get the impression I'm unlikely to persuade anyone that fertility is more worth addressing than mastitis. So that's the basic approach. That's the kind of classic UK way to approach this. Work that's been modified and reused and recycled a lot, and it was a very kind of game-changing concept when they first came up with it. As I said, I think this can vary enormously between different herds, so I would always try and tailor this and customize it to each herd that I work with, because you can get some quite different results. And because that method's so transparent and so easy to understand, the concept behind it is so simple, it's fairly easy to come up with tools like this one that will allow you to modify that and make sure that it's matching a particular herd, and it allows you to update the cost inputs over time. You can make it more complicated. So you can look at, for example, the distribution of calving intervals within a particular herd. This is always quite instructive to do, actually, as I'll talk about more in the lecture tomorrow afternoon when I'm going to talk about monitoring fertility. I think calving index is absolutely not the thing that I would rely on most as a monitoring index, and there are a lot of drawbacks with it, but particularly when you're thinking about cost of fertility, it does have some advantages, and I would often do this as a kind of periodic exercise for the herds that I work with. We're very used to looking at the average calving index for a particular herd, but it's very interesting to look at how those distribute. So this would be a pretty typical distribution for a UK herd, 40-day voluntary wait period, and a 14% 21-day preg rate. So 14% of the eligible cows getting pregnant every 21 days is roughly UK average. This is what the distribution of calving intervals would look like for those. And if we superimpose on that the tail end of a typical lactation, this line here represents the yield per day that we're gaining as we add on litres, as we add on days at the tail end of lactation there. So you can see it does tail off, but not massively. So cost will step up with each 21-day block that we look at. And you can use that curve to estimate cost for each period there, and then have a much more realistic, accurate estimate of what the fertility costs are for this particular herd. So again, as a kind of conservative average, we might be getting up to figures of roughly £3 a day out at the tail end here, but even in a herd with a fairly high average, a lot of the additional days are still over here on the left. So every cow with a 425-day calving interval will add some days at 365 to 395, some more days at 395 to 400, and so on. So average cost still often is over towards the left-hand side. I said milk price can potentially be quite important in these calculations, and it's very clear that we've seen a big diversity in what's happened in UK herds in the last few years. So historically in the UK, milk price has been pretty consistent across herds. In the last 5 years, that's completely changed. So the range here is going to be fairly realistic. You know, there will be plenty of herds right across this spectrum from 20 pence a litre to low 30s at the moment. That does have quite a big impact on potential for return on investment in fertility. So if we think about probably a typical cost, again, in a kind of mythical average herd, in a very low milk price situation, that might average out somewhere around kind of 175 per day. In a herd with these are probably mostly likely to be supermarket aligned contracts out on the right-hand side there, or niche contracts, that might easily get up to £3 a day. So higher milk prices do give you more potential for return on investment here, but it's also worth considering that fertility is an area, unlike some of the disease things particularly, where often you can make quite big gains with very, very small cost investments, particularly in terms of upfront investment. Lots of this can just be about protocols, approaches. There doesn't need to be big cost involved in improving fertility. So even at the low end there, even with milk price fairly low, very, very often there are things that you can do that are very strongly likely to have a net cost benefit. Okay. So that's the very basic approach. So to kind of take that assumption, the basic principle that we're swapping an average day from a 305-day lactation, postponing that one and swapping it for an extra day on the tail end of lactation. I think if I'm honest, there probably are some things that aren't completely accounted for within that model. So for example, it doesn't necessarily give us an answer on the ideal target for calving index, how much profitability is there in terms of, you know, how short is it profitable to go. Probably doesn't acknowledge the possibility that cows can spend an unprofitably large proportion of their life dry. However, some of those things are very difficult to incorporate into a simple, transparent structure. So the way people have tended to try and approach this, if they're going to do it more robustly, is to use a simulation model. And fertility lends itself really, really well to simulation models because it follows quite a predictable sequence of events, and it's fairly, you know, a herd of cows will behave in a relatively predictable manner. So the details of how people have tried to do this vary between different papers and different work groups, but the basic structure is the same. So you're still really doing the same thing. You decide what are the important inputs to your model, so what things are going to affect your results. So those might be things like level of yield, age structure, voluntary wait period, 21-day preg rate. And you can base those on real herd data. So you give each of those a distribution, and you say, okay, I think voluntary wait period varies between 30 and 60 days and is most commonly somewhere near to 40. You then simulate lactations, and you simulate lactations within cows and cows within herds, so that you basically generate simulated cows, build them up in simulated herds, and across the herd you can amalgamate some outputs. So you'll end up with things like total herd milk production, calving index, some of those outcome type things. The idea there is that you've then got, for each imagined or simulated herd, you've got a set of inputs. So is it a high yielding or low yielding herd? Is their fertility good or bad? And you've got your output, overall how much milk did they produce? And then you can start to look for correlations between those two things. So it gives you a way of understanding how the two things are related. So in this sense, we're particularly interested in how fertility performance is related to some economic measure of success. The advantages of doing it this way are it's likely to give you much, much more robust results. So the results of these analyses are probably likely to be more accurate and better to rely on. They're more likely to reflect what happens in the real world. And you can use these to produce results that cover a really wide variety of situations. So you can set these up in quite a flexible way so that you can represent a lot of different potential things that might happen. The big drawback of these is that the method and the approach is much clearer. It's harder to explain exactly how people have got to the results that they come to. And because of that, really, it's sometimes quite difficult either to tailor those results to individual farms or to update them over time. In order to do those things, you need to generate some sort of software tool. Those definitely do exist, but it can be a barrier to implementing results of these approaches in practice. So there has been a reasonably recent project that used this approach to look at potential cost of fertility in UK herds. This ended up as a report. It didn't go through peer-reviewed publication. So this approach did allow them to look for the optimum calving interval. And interestingly, this came to the conclusion that really as short as possible was better. So particularly with mature cows, much less marked in heifers, it was better just to get them pregnant as early as possible and just get more peaks of lactation in. So with heifers, not a massive difference, but it plateaus down to about 350. So essentially, it was still better to aim for 360, 350, even with first lactation heifers. I think in some ways what happens over here isn't that relevant because most people are over here anyway, so for an awful lot of people there's still scope to improve without getting into the argument of exactly where you're aiming at. So they came to those numbers for overall cost, so not a million miles away from what we've just looked at, a little bit higher, on average £2.73 a day, but much lower in heifers and a bit higher in cows. And these are the components of where those costs came from. So again, they used a value per extra day on calving interval. So most of those costs came from margin over milk, a little bit for calf sales. They did allocate a cost to culling change, so that was worth a fair bit. Some from extra serves, which again, sometimes those would represent double counting. And this model used periparturient disease direct costs only, so they ignored any culling or yield effects, which is why the periparturient disease one there is so low. So they completely avoided double counting, but probably also underestimated the true cost. So we've talked a bit about two bits of UK work that try and allocate a cost to every extra day on a cow's calving interval. The advantage of that is that they're fairly easy to explain, they're straightforward to step through, they're easy to tailor to individual situations, but they can be problematic in that they really need to account for the distribution of those calving intervals. It's not just about the average cow, it's about how many days each cow is putting on at each stage. And some of the methods for doing this are probably oversimplistic, although when people have applied more complex and probably more robust methods, they've tended to come up with surprisingly similar results. As a final point on these approaches, it's really, really common when you talk about this with farmers, particularly high-yielding herds, it's very common for people to say, yeah, I know that applies on average, but my cows are much higher yielding, they've got very persistent flat lactation curves. Absolutely critical to look at lactation curve in your own herd. So these two, the left-hand one here is the one that I showed at the start. That's all the herds in that set of data. The right-hand one here is lactations with a 305-day yield of greater than 10,000 litres, so what would count as fairly high-yielding lactations in a UK context. You can see the shapes are very, very similar, and I find this extremely consistently doing consultancy with individual farms. When you look at where the extra milk comes from in 10.5, 11,500 litre herds, a lot of that is usually driven by the first 100 days. It's often driven by higher peaks rather than very, very flat lactations. So it is still very important to manage fertility in those. Just going to finish off by briefly looking at some work from overseas. So there have been lots of other more recent studies that have looked at this and resulted in some nice publications. The Northern American approach to this generally is to try and allocate a value to every unit on 21-day preg rate. So for every extra percentage that you put on your herd's 21-day preg rate, they've tried to allocate a unit cost to that. This scatter plot on the left here summarizes 5 or 6 studies. A lot of those have come from Wisconsin and Cornell. So there's some very nice simulation-based models there. And generally, they've found that it has this sort of shape. So if you start off at a very low level, UK average is probably here somewhere. You have quite a big potential to make a big a big net gain, but that tends to flatten off as you get bigger. So the additional value of an extra percentage point on 21-day preg rate tends to taper off as you get up to a higher starting point. So if you think about that in terms of where the UK average herd is and convert those dollars into pounds, that would equate to roughly £10 for every unit on 21-day preg rate per cow per year. So Stuart Russell recently estimated that in a cattle practice paper slightly higher. He came up with £16 per percent per cow per year. You can obviously convert a 21-day preg rate to the expected calving interval that you get for that. So I use this as a way of trying to sense check and compare that to the older UK approaches. So this is a very, very basic kind of model of this that I knocked up just for this talk. This is just assuming that you keep breeding until you've got 90% of cows pregnant, and this is showing the relationship between calving interval and 21-day preg rate there. So we can see a unit on 21-day preg rate around the UK average is probably worth something like 6 to 9 days off the herd's calving index. So that would fit with the sort of ballpark figures. You know, if we accept £2, £2.50 a day, that fits with the sort of figures we came up with from the papers that we've just seen. So again, this tends to support that sort of ballpark figure. I mentioned if you build a simulation model, yep, you can use it to produce results for publication, but you can also make a tool that's usable on farm. So this is the Wisconsin Cornell model. It's freely available to download from their website. It's a very, very neat piece of work. It's designed for the US situation, but it's quite flexible, so there's an awful lot of different input things that you can put in. Probably more designed for looking at different fixed-time AI program options, but it does allow you to look at heat detection options as well. And it is quite a useful tool. It's a very nice simulation model that it's based on, but again, it is a little bit black box, and that essentially gives you a net expected gain in dollars per cow per year. So it can be quite a useful tool, but even reading the paper behind it, it can be difficult to understand exactly what they've done and exactly what the mechanisms within this are, and that's inevitably a drawback with simulation models. So again, it's particularly difficult when it comes to the periparturient disease aspect to see where that comes into the model. And again, it comes up with a number that's a bit harder to explain where you've got to, so it's often harder to get good buy-in to that. But it is potentially a very, very useful tool for people that are very interested in getting into the nuts and bolts. So the advantages of trying to allocate a cost per unit of 21-day preg rate. Often these use very robust simulation-based methods. They reflect calving interval and its distribution and culling rate together, so you don't need to worry about having two things to account for. And 21-day preg rate is probably the most important day-to-day or week-to-week key performance metric for measuring fertility. Your rate of converting eligible cows into pregnancies is ultimately the critical thing to measure. Drawbacks, though, these methods are much more opaque, they're harder to tailor and update, and it's harder to be sure they apply to our UK herds. And they also don't reflect the herd's voluntary wait period. So a herd with an 80-day voluntary wait period compared to a herd with a 40-day voluntary wait period, the 80-day herd are very likely to be losing out substantially through having longer calving intervals, but that won't be reflected using this approach. Has been some work on value per pregnancy generated. That's largely been superseded now by the idea of allocating cost to every unit on 21-day preg rate. Quick word on seasonal calving herds. The key thing that they like to focus on tends to be 6-week in calf rate. So there's a couple of papers here, one from Ireland that came up with a value of what would equate to roughly £6 per cow per year for every percentage point that you add to 6-week in calf rate. Again, if you work it out, that's not wildly different to the sort of ballparks that we've been talking about so far. The Kiwis tend to estimate lower costs, although it's very I couldn't find a publication on which that was based, but the numbers that they taught to equate to roughly £2 to £4 per cow per year for every percent they add. Plausibly, that's because the baseline level of performance in Kiwi herds is pretty high compared to Irish herds. And as we saw with the US work, the better your starting point, the less value there is for every extra bit that you gain. So final couple of slides on how you can use these principles. So he said it's quite interesting to think about the cost of a missed heat. Even if we accept that £2 a day is a very conservative, realistic starting point for estimating cost, an additional cycle, so postponing your next opportunity to inseminate the cow, is going to be worth something like 38 to 52 quid. And normal cycles, 19 to 26 days long. So if we think about that in terms of room for investment, talked about this in the farmer workshop this morning, one additional heat detected would pay for 50-odd scratch cards or KMARs, so those heat mount detectors, very commonly very cost beneficial, or 250 applications of tail paint. Really not looking for many extra heats in order to justify these investments because the investment itself is so small. And you can use a very similar principle to evaluate the value of treating non-pregnant cows at vet visits, and indeed the value of having vet visits at all. And I'll talk about that in the workshop tomorrow morning. You can use exactly the same approach to estimate the potential value of synchronization and using some fixed-time AI programs. So more commonly in the UK, people had used these as a kind of backstop. So this is days in milk at first serve, voluntary wait period here, first 24 days where we'll expect every cow to have a heat somewhere in there. Inevitably, quite a few won't get served within that period. So a common strategy is to say, okay, if a cow gets to that point, we'll enroll her in an off-sync program and serve her at a fixed time 10 days later. So there we're really moving this tail back to this point. So we're moving the average of those cows from here roughly back to here. So we're looking at a saving of 17 days for every cow that ends up being served at a fixed time. So generally, in most situations, that will give you a reasonable cost benefit. But there would be some things to consider. So you generally get a lower conception rate to a fixed time AI, and some cows will get enrolled here. So they'll get their first GnRH jab and then get seen in heat anyway. So that will adds to the effective cost. Okay, so I think in summary, key things to remember for me are this will vary from herd to herd, and it is very useful to look at your own data. I'll talk about this much more tomorrow, but these decisions really need to be based on a herd's own data. You can't do this sort of thing just plucking figures out of the air. Milk price does have an impact, and higher milk prices generally will give you more return for investment in fertility, but a lot of the investments you're considering here are financially very small, and herds on a low milk price clearly are looking for every efficiency saving they can make. Very commonly, fertility is somewhere they've got scope to make some. And for me, a really interesting thing that comes out of looking at the literature is that using much more robust but much more complex and opaque methods seems to give us, under current conditions, quite similar answers to using more transparent, very simple and tailorable methods. So for me, I'd very often use those with a farm's own data, come up with a cost for that farm, and then be reassured by the fact that that tends to give me a very similar estimate to more robust models that I probably have more belief in. Okay, everyone seems to be on about Twitter today, so if you're interested, follow our Dairy Herd Health Group account at Nottingham. If you have any questions or you want to interact with me, feel free to follow me or just drop me an email. Always very pleased to hear from anyone. And Nottingham would also like me to show you this statement that indemnifies them from anything you might try and ask for relating to my talk. So basically, don't believe anything that I've said.
Good man, Chris. I think you're our first speaker to employ a lawyer to end your talk, so I appreciate that.
It's fun working for a corporate.
Yeah, no. Any questions for Chris before we take a little break?
Feel free to come and ask me individually afterwards or in the bar.
Can I ask you just one?
Of course.
Would you mind? Right, 21-day preg rate.
Yep.
And versus culling decision. In America, the last 2 years, the replacement rate cost has been almost nothing.
Yep.
So how do you balance the importance of getting her in calf against the culling decision of that cow?
Yeah, really good question. And that really does have to be an individual farm-by-farm decision. Right. So for me, the culling thing, the really critical point is that you see that in the context of the other pressures on your culling. So fertility is one of the things that's competing to cull cows, but that depends on all the other things that are competing to cull cows, and it depends on how far behind you are with your replacement pipeline. So you're always working 2 years in advance. Those become extremely difficult things that need really looking at on a herd-by-herd basis. So although it sounds like a horrendous cop-out, and in reality it is one.
No, that's great. No, thank you. Can I have the luxury of just one more question then?
Of course, yeah.
On heifers, looking at the yield curve, I appreciate that was early 2000s, eh?
Yep.
So let's take it where it is now. Do you think it's flatter because of genetic potential, or do you think it's because of environmental pressure that the heifers are under?
Good question. I think it's not likely to be just genetics, because that was consistently true to the same extent across all the years in my data set. It's very frequently demonstrated elsewhere in the world. So it doesn't seem that that's just a kind of time thing, and they're gradually improving or changing or catching up in some way. It almost certainly that is just a physiological feature of the first lactation. I think that's generally the accepted reason for it. I don't think we fully understand the mechanisms, but I don't think it's probably considered to be an environmental thing either. I think the clincher for me there is that it tends to be very consistent across herds. So when you look at individual herds, the difference in shape is generally quite similar between herds, which would suggest it's less likely to be an environmental thing.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Stop
Appreciate
asking
that.
me difficult questions.
Sorry, mate. There's a question? Yeah, please. Ian.
Yeah, I've got a question.
I can hear you.
It was just great to see another talk which was about a more significant economic disease than mastitis. But
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have a question, Mark.
Oh, thank heavens.
The question is, have you evaluated at what point risk of death around the periparturient period negates any benefit in days open?
Yeah, that's included in some of the models. So like I said, in the most transparent, very simple model that we started off with, they allocated a cost per day for that, which probably isn't wildly unrealistic, and actually doesn't really come close to wiping out the increased benefit of extra litres or extra margin on the bottom line. So you would probably have to have a very high disease situation and a herd that are considering shortening their calving interval from an already low point to get close to that situation.
Thanks for the question, Ian. And thank you, Chris. I think I'll draw it to a close at that point. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.